This is a room called the Collaboratory. It's where collaboration across the College of Arts and Sciences is supposed to happen. And we are very fortunate to have the opportunity to do a lot of events down here. Afterwards, we'll go upstairs and show you our most beautiful, amazing arts administration, education, and policy quarters. It's really amazing. So we are blessed. Okay, I want to welcome our first speaker. He is brave to go first. He is wonderful, good, solid citizen to go first, and I knew that he would be able to do it with grace. So here you go, Tim Smith.
Thank you. Is this on here? Okay. And thank you, everyone. I'm going to be showing a video that I made during a recent month-long residency, artist residency, that was in the village of Ballyvaughan in County Clare in Ireland. It's in the area of the West, which is about an hour drive south of Galway, and it's known as the Burren. And I'll make connections to the content of the video as well as the area itself throughout this presentation. This is a very different kind of presentation for me than anything that I'm used to giving, but I feel that it makes many kind of direct and indirect connections to my research. So I'm just going to give it a go tonight. For now, I just want to acknowledge that the video shows this 3-mile descent from a peak plateau of a mountain called Capanwalla, which is right behind Ballyvaughan. And it's about 1,000 feet in elevation. So it's a mountain, it's not treacherous and it's not so steep, but it's still a healthy climb. But I also want to advise you to avoid really focusing your eyes on the video for too long, because it's a first-person perspective and it may cause motion sickness. And the last thing I want you to take away from this presentation is the feeling that you have to vomit. So I've used image stabilization. I slowed it down to 50%, and I think it's going to be okay. Just focus more on me and just have it. It's more background than anything else. So this could be a disaster. I'm thinking of like Stand By Me right now. Okay, Barfarama. The trail coils adjacent to the loosely paved back road, the Burren Way, as it's called, leading past the base of Mount Capanwalla. It's marked by decades of tire tracks carved into the wild grass to form parallel dirt grooves, winding and ascending at an almost absurdly steep 60-degree incline. The path meanders for at least a half mile without any markers that would signify a destination ahead. The only index along the way is difficult to ignore, a sea of limestone debris to the right of the path, nor are there any signifying indicators that would direct anyone to venture off this winding trail. And common sense and good sense would indicate that this field of scattered rock formations is certainly not a path, specifically because it leads up to the even steeper ascent of the tremendous base of the mountain. One would initially view engaging this non-path as an act of nonsense, not just insofar as acknowledging that taking this path would assume an attitude of sense without ground, but also in the most empirical aspect of a physical limestone terrain that consists of literally dispersed and fragmented ground. Why have I never continued along where those tire tracks lead up the carved path that curls around the base? Why have I always wandered off that path to the vast uncertain non-path instead? Or if it is a path, it's more akin to being swallowed up into the sweeping bay than wading along a winding creek. This new non-path, this field of openness, calls forth of smooth space, of deterritorialized space. It calls one closer to skim along what feels like the edges of chaos. I lived in Ballyvaughan once before, 7 years ago. I was a post-baccalaureate student at the Burren College of Art, which houses the studio art program for the National University of Ireland in Galway. My intentions for enrolling in the program was to engage in an immersive studio academic environment and hopefully leverage that experience into an MFA program, which I eventually completed here at Ohio State. And while I was there, my approach to art making certainly did open up from a more rigid conceptual structure to a looser and more emergent way of working. But I still thought of an artist practice as one that involved sitting around in the studio, hoping to discover an idea that was out there, waiting to be harnessed and formulated into art. This is the conventional way of understanding how art is made. I assumed that everyone else was making art this way, so I should as well. The mindset that art is different, artists are different. Artists are unique in that we possess creativity, again, in the conventional sense. And with that creativity, we discover what is out there, harnessing our gift or talent. In a way, I was going along with the traditional belief that artists are unique because art making is radically different from everyday life. What I failed to realize back then was that the problem isn't that art needs to be different from everyday life. It's that everyday life needs to be approached differently, and thus it can be seen as one and the same with art. There are 3 routes to the studio from the village center 2 miles away. The first is a narrow, 2-lane corkscrew road, which is about the width of a one-way side street in the States. Take away sidewalks and add a 100-kilometer-an-hour speed limit, and the road is a series of near-death experiences for any pedestrian courageous enough to follow the most direct route to the workspace. The second route to the studio is called the Wood Loop, which meets up with the Burren Way. It's the back route, and it offers every quintessential aspect of Irish charm imaginable along the way, including sheep grazing in the front yard of cottages, the 3-room elementary school with adjacent rugby pitch and footballs field, and cow pastures teeming with landmines of perfectly rounded dung that are easily mistaken for polished rocks scattered along the field. And one learns very quickly to avoid stepping on any rocks whatsoever in this area. And this is just the first half mile of the morning commute. Once this unconventional village path becomes a more concentrated, narrowed route, all indicators of culture have ostensibly vanished. The trail winds through the more proper elements of the Burren, a surface of mud, grass, and randomly strewed limestone rocks. The path descends around one corner to a moon-like landscape diffused by the peculiarity of various plant species from both arid and temperate origins. And then only a few steps later, the path curves and dips into a lush, dark heaviness of a miniature tropical forest, as if traversing one ecological microcosm to another in a matter of moments. Such incongruence is commonplace in the Burren. The third path is the most ambiguous insofar as that it's not actually a path, but it's a kind of field, and that's this path here. And one has to be willing to get lost in order to gain a new kind of bearing. This is a field that requires a certain attitude to embrace. It's a field of experimentation, of courage to let the passage break down and fail at many points. It's a field of relying not merely on the self, but opening up to the various elements that in their own way are active in participating with the encounter of the passage. Most importantly, beyond toying with the loss of direction, I'm going to turn it down a little bit. The field calls forth a loss of structuring, even encouraging a loss of the self. It's not a conventional, meditative, or contemplative approach to being lost in thought. The field invites a new way of subjectless thinking. In a sense, it's difficult to find order in movement and language. It is an experience that approaches pure difference and the struggle to reconcile the fact that language will always prove inadequate in describing difference. Pure difference cannot be articulated. It cannot be apprehended. The Burren is an environment infused with transformation. The limestone landscape is exposed by its history, a past literally embedded in its present. From the calcium-rich skeletal remains of marine life etched into its once Mediterranean seabed from 300 million years ago, to the shales, slit stones, limestones, carried to the north, from the north, through glaciation 20,000 years ago, and arbitrarily deposited along the land. The region is a convergence of displacement. a paradoxical zigzagging historical process of Arctic and tropical formations which from a viewpoint today suggests stability and fixity in its current temperate presence. But this is an illusion. The Burren is unremittingly undergoing a process of change, just as everything is in the world. It's always becoming. Sometimes the speeds and intensities of transformation occur at a greater rate, such as the spring 2 years ago, when months of heavy rains and winds create an acute erosion, causing massive rock slides. Other times the process is more gradual, but still noticeable in a human lifespan. The effects of cultural, technological change as another form of productive process, or climate change as a different catastrophic demonstration of geomorphological shifts. These are material processes, encounters with forces and intensive differences or intensities of the chaos of the world. Everything is affected by the vast multiplicity of assemblages that form the world. Human thought is no different. Something in the world forces us to think. This something is an encounter, is an object not of recognition, but of a fundamental encounter. It's opposed to recognition. There's much to unpack in this passage from Deleuze and Guattari from A Thousand Plateaus. It asserts that thinking is an inherently creative act. Thought is created, shocked, or jolted through an encounter with something in the world that forces us. What is this something, that force, if it is not to be discovered, but rather created? It's not a recognizable image of thought. It's not preconceived, nor is it presupposed. It's not an image of thought based on identification, classification, or hierarchy. Those are the images that constrain thought, or constrain thinking of thought differently. Instead, it opens up a new approach towards experiencing life. We are not at the center of existence as human beings. We are subjects among other active subjects, or participants in the world. Human, non-human, organic, non-organic, not other objects. And Kapinawala Mountain exists as a part of that productive process, just as humans do. It is affected by assemblages of forces, speeds, and intensities, just as we are. Its movements are just much slower than ours. Through its creation 500 million years ago, to its reshaping from volcanic activity 15 million years ago, to glaciation in the past 150,000 years, and various stages of tectonic plate movements, erosion, and sedimentation that continues today. Assemblages are not stable identities, or stable entities. They process the interaction between disparate elements forming a compound of encounters and relations. An assemblage resists attempts to grasp or define what it is, but rather the productive question is related to what it can do and how it functions. As humans, we are an assemblage of the contingent virtual processing of genes becoming a being, but also the contingent processes of becoming through social, cultural, and political dynamics that alter the shape and assemblage of a person. Thus, assemblages are not simply physical entities, but they're interactions of systems and structures, words and meanings, desires and expressions that shape not just our existence, but the existence of everything in the world. The contingencies involved with the interaction of assemblages is always a continual, emergent process with indeterminate boundaries, always in motion, always changing, always emergent, constantly enacting and shifting from within. My experience and my experiment traversing Kapinawala every day was a convergence of assemblages, not as an attempt to converge art and life, as I may have tried to achieve several years ago when I first climbed that mountain. In fact, I distinctly remember standing atop the peak plateau at the time, waiting for something to happen, just as I had been doing 1,000 feet below, sitting in my studio. I was waiting for art to be discovered, as if it was a transcendent entity that simply required me to look hard enough, to concentrate more intently. I find it interesting that back then, I felt this struggle took place at that peak, as if I felt that it required positioning from above to have a panoramic view of the structure of the world down below, as if it would offer a completeness in thought that I needed for discovering what I was looking for in art. And that's really why so little actually did happen on Kapinawala 7 years ago. I was searching for unity, for cohesiveness, for order, rather than embracing the unknown, to undo what I think I know or what I think I should know. In fact, the most productive process is to acknowledge that we don't know, or perhaps simply not even paying attention to knowledge in such a situation. The two most direct paths from the village to the studio are very distinctive routes. Even the wooden loop to the Burren Way has arrows spray painted on the stones and wooden posts to assure the hiker that he or she is going in the right direction. Trails of stones piled a foot or so high along the edges act as subtle guardrails to ensure that one stays on track. Like any city, town, or rural village, the paths are constructed to create order out of chaos, to territorialize the vastness of space. Even the field of limestone debris that covers Mount Capanawala shows hints of that territorialization. Trails in the heavy grass, muddied, worn, to direct a common passage from hikers in recent past. Some rocks seem to have shifted into trail formation, hinting the intentional repositioning by humans over the years to offer a less treacherous passage. Or perhaps this appearance is just my dogmatic image of thought, envisioning and sensing order where there is none. Maybe I'm so conditioned to search for spaces of territorialization, spaces of comfort, amidst such openness, that I create the illusion of a pathway that seems most convenient and most familiar. But this time, 7 years later, I've been resisting taking that path, or at least the route that I think I see, the one that is already carved for me. I'm exploring a different passage, one that is unfamiliar, where the virtual emerges through experience, through experimentation, through letting go of my desperately tight grip on needing to know. The virtual emerges through this openness to transformation, through becoming other. My daily experiences on Capanawala is one of the many exercises of relinquishing that subjective perspective that says, I am the person who creates. Instead, what if the question is changed to perhaps, what might happen, what might the world be like such that things that were not there before can come into existence? With this attitude, the perspective shifts from one subjective to one that's ontological, a creative ontology. The intention was not to seek out or discover some creative thing pre-existing, waiting to be found and apprehended. My experience was that of a different kind of creation, one that emerges from pure difference rather than recognition. There are potentialities that are real, but they exist in the virtual realm. They've not been actualized, and they may never be actualized. But that's the great challenge of art making, of learning, of living, of thought. Sometimes potentiality emerges through actualization, and often it doesn't. And the only way we can find out if that becoming can happen is through experimentation. And with experimentation, there's failure, much failure. And that's uncomfortable. But being uncomfortable is vital to this kind of process. And we can continue to know what everyone else knows and remain on the paths that have been organized for us. At least that's comfortable. Or we could carve a slit in the fence, scale it, or burrow under it, and take a line of flight into the unknown, the unfamiliar, the unsettling, creating a new plane of composition by embracing a push toward chaos, a creation of a new path. One might draw out something from the virtual realm to the actual, embracing play, embracing chance and risk, and undoing knowledge to create a different way of living. How do we move forward more effectively? How do we learn more effectively? How might we live more effectively? These are questions that Gilles Deleuze poses. An aesthetic thought, one and the same with art making. The courage and persistence as the process continually and productively breaks down. As we learn, as Beckett says, we learn to fail better. And we continue to fail better until the potentialities and intensities of art making, of thinking, of living emerge and actualize something new, something that does work. The repetition of the productive elements of past failures that create the assemblage of learning, the past embedded in the present, fossilized into the new. The fragile ground of scattered limestone fragments present a newly familiar sensation of balance, placement, and pivot. The field appears so stable, but each step is a toss of the dice. Some of the surface is firmly embedded in the ground, but most of the stones lay atop one another, hinged as precariously as they were deposited from melting glaciers thousands of years ago. It seems like a treacherous passage, with jagged rocks teetering atop one another, hundreds of pounds tilting to another side with the clunking sound that I haven't heard anywhere else in my life. Like so many sounds, smells, and feelings of the uniquely chilly, humid atmosphere seeping into my skin and bones, these bodily sensations are specific to the burn. Unfamiliar in the years since I last visited, but instantly and eerily familiar when I returned. Exploring the burn is like encountering a force much like that, something in the world that makes us think. It's impossible to grasp. It can only be intuited. It can only be palpated. I've never been more productive in an artistic practice as I had in those 4 weeks at the artist residency in Ballyvaughan. And I surmise it's because I was unable to distinguish where everyday life ended and art began, or vice versa. And that's the result of a specific kind of attitude, to open all of my everyday experiences into art making, and to open all of my art practice into life. There was no trick to it. The solution wasn't simply to go live in Ireland for a bit, or to get out in nature. In fact, I spent hours each day in the studio. I made paintings and drawings and sculptures and installations. I made photographs and site-specific works and performances, and I made videos. I made them in all the places that I visited. I made at least one artwork a day, which was an entanglement with art and life, an art life that continues back here in Columbus. The only explanation I have as to why this experience was different is that I didn't stop to think about whether the activity I was engaged in was considered art or life. I just did. It was unself-conscious. It wasn't about categorizing one thing or another. It wasn't about worrying if what I was doing would amount to anything, whether it was something that could be called art or something that could be called time well spent. These thoughts didn't cross my mind. And looking back now, if I were to attribute defining categories or identification to what I did make, I could certainly say that many of the projects that I made as art really didn't work. But there are so many elements that kept repeating as I continued to experiment. The productive residue of failures eventually became something else, something that may be called everyday life, something that may be called art. And I'm avoiding calling it anything, at least for now. These are all ideas that I had been exploring prior to this artist residency. This wasn't some magical epiphany that unfolded over 4 weeks. The questions remain still as they did when I left. How might we think about art education from a perspective that frees us from the structuring order of categories and hierarchy that define art as a separate entity from life? But in order to move forward and continuing to address those questions, I had to experiment for myself. I have to practice what I'm teaching. And as this talk now makes evident, I haven't let go of engaging those destabilizing sensations that open up to the risk and to the fear and to the unfamiliar. But it also opens up the new and the invigorating and life as one with research, as one with learning, and as one with art. Thanks. And appropriately enough, here is that dirt path that leads up to the mountain, coming down. Is everyone feeling okay? Not sick? No one's sick, right? But I do want to just show I kind of turned back to the actual mountain that I was just climbing down. This is so slow compared to what I was doing. I was really hauling ass when I was going down. Come on, turn it. Oh, so slow. I'm a really fast walker too, so it's just like, this is killing me. I don't know if it even matters. There we go. It's amazing, there are all these plateaus, which is kind of interesting. I didn't refer to it as such, but you think you're getting to the top, but you just have so much more to go because it's just a gradual incline. And that's just all limestone. Anyway, okay. Great. So I'll open up to everyone.
Do you want to go first? Or I can go first if you like.
You can go first, yeah.
Thanks, Tim. It's nice to hear you talk and to hear about that, to kind of see the experience.
Yeah.
You know, besides just kind of hearing you talk about it too. I think there's a lot to deal with if And I am definitely curious, I don't know how Mindy feels, but I'm curious in having the audience participate more.
Absolutely.
But in general with everybody's talk. But I guess the question I would have for you, just like the most immediate one, is that you talked a lot about like these ideas of like pure difference or a loss of structure, or a deterritorialized space. And then you also talked about these productive failures. And I would be curious how you link those two, or have you thought about linking those two, and how can you talk about like a loss of subject or subjectivity and a failure at the same time? Have you tried to conceptualize that?
Yeah, I guess
idea
failure is more kind of the conventions that we would call it as failure. It's something that's kind of attributed as failure, but maybe that's just in the negative connotations that go with the word failure. Again, it's like fighting with language here as to what that actually means. And that's another thing that I was trying to be very careful about in terms of what words I was using that could signify something else. Like creativity is thrown around so much, but it's very specific in terms of what Deleuze would say creativity is. And so in terms of failure, maybe that's something that's a little bit more of an open word that I might want to reconsider as to, things that don't materialize or things that don't come forward, that's considered a failure to me, and that's a very productive failure. And I don't see failure in that sort of negative term, because one thing that I always did as an artist, or I always tried to move on if something wasn't working, and I think one really important sort of aspect of my practice as an artist in the past year or so has been to really see things through that didn't feel like it was going anywhere, because you learn so much that could be pulled forward from that. And so those wouldn't even be called failures. Those are maybe like sketches or something, but you hope that it turns into something, but it doesn't. And it's even difficult to say turns into something. Turns into what? Like art or life or what? So it's the language that is being used has to be really carefully, worded. It's hard to talk about language not really working so much, but having to use language to do that. So I don't know if that really answers the question or touches on it, but that connection between letting go and failure, or that connection between losing the self and failure, is something that I'm thinking about, but maybe I don't have as much a direct link to that, other than it's something that I experience, but I'm just not sure how I can put my finger on that. But it's a very interesting question. Yeah.
I think it was interesting that the connection between that and fear. I think you made a lot of strong connections about how fear functions in failure, and it seems like I think it's kind of cool that you're doing that. But how do you get yourself into? How do you acclimate yourself to a process that you feel is exposes, I don't know, this? How do you get past the fear? I guess is part of it. How do you?
Well, that's where it was just the shortest sentence that I used was like, just do, and you just throw yourself into it, and that's also something that is very unfamiliar for me. I'm always thinking I always would want to think in a more calculated way of thinking about what the risks are and everything, and the time that I'm spending on this, as opposed to what happens if it just happens, if I just do it and not worry so much. But there's still, that fear never goes away. It's just you're engaging in it, or you're letting it happen. And so there's a lot of kind of psychological things that are also coming through this. But yeah, it's tough to address that, in terms of, this is something that I'm addressing in the larger research, but I also don't know how this comes through in terms of the type of writing that this is right now, and I've never really done anything like this, so it's kind of like
beautiful.
How can ideas come through without actually stopping to say, okay, this means this and this means that, and so you have to be really careful with how it filters through, and some things might get lost and some things might, but that's kind of also how life works as well.
That's great.
Yeah.
I can certainly ask more, but
Yeah.
if other people have questions, please, I think it would be nice to hear from others as well.
And also, I would love to have, continue these conversations outside of this
Yeah, I'm going to buy you
having
coffee.
everyone staring at me kind of environment. Yeah.
Okay, I have one.
Well, Veronica has.
I think I called Debbie.
I can't see you.
I can't.
Oh.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, Veronica.
I really liked the video, even if you thought it might be nauseating,
Mhm.
because for me it captures one of the best things about hiking, which is that you can't see your destination most of the time. And I think that having that visual constantly in play during the talk really emphasized, I think, some of the key parts of Deleuze, this sort of moving away from linearity, moving away from fixed understandings, and the territorialization really became manifest. And so, congratulations.
Well,
I thought it was really successful.
Thanks. Yeah, I made that just to send, just to put on maybe like Vimeo or something to show friends and stuff. I never thought that it would ever be included in any way, but it wasn't until after I got back that happened. So, yeah.
But it does make you wonder what role sort of the idea of the fixed point or the goal has in terms of your conceptions of, creativity and failure and sort of the seamlessness between art and life.
Yeah, it's hard to say I don't have any sort of goals and to keep that really wide open, but that's also, you don't want to be in a situation where you're absent of structure. I'm not saying that we need to get rid of that structure. It's just more of, and the word experiment comes up, and that's another complicated word that I'm trying to kind of figure out. And right now, that's really that's the only way I can kind of articulate it through the different sort of manifestations of experimentation. And that's more along the lines of thinking the goal or the fixity in itself is also embedded in saying, like, I'm going to experiment, and that's a goal as well. So it's like trying to understand that you still need goals, you still need that structure, but if you can experiment, or if you can kind of move toward sort of trying to undo it just a little bit, or really kind of playing with it, and that's something that is important to me, and seeing where those parameters are, if they're, how to define parameters in that sense when you're talking in this way. So these are things that I'm still working out in terms of, really, again, coming back to language in that. But yeah, they still have goals, and they still have that. It's just that maybe veering off a little bit is something that creates those situations where something that you haven't seen before emerges. Yeah. So, hi, Kathleen. Hi.
Can be used sparingly as a container in which to have, like you were going to the studio, right?
Yeah,
So you had a reason to go.
Yeah,
But
I was
that
just taking a different
gave
route.
you the opening to just open up to the experience. So the notion of using goals, knowing that most goals are going to be changed, not expecting them to crystallize the way one has, but rather as using them strategically, if you will, as a way of having that container of going into this alternative space. Like, for example, from time to time, I mentioned that the Greeks had two senses of time, chronos and kairos, and they interplay with each other. But chronos tends to be a bit dictatorial, and that's where, and yet kairos can also end up, the energy can end up petering out. So this dance between using clock time as an open framework to just experience things, seems to me to be very productive.
Yeah, I think, I mean, time plays a huge role in it, and I think again, it's also the way we use definitions and words is something in language is something that I'm really trying to take a step back from, and I even still cringe when I'm saying like, oh, openness. What does that mean? You know, those sort of things. And like, so what's the intention of using that word, or what's the intention of using the word, you know, goal or experiment? And that's what I feel my goal is to unpack that more, and through the actual dissertation is unpacking those things, because it starts to really complicate things in terms of, so what do you actually, what's actually being said, what's trying to be, how do you articulate something when you're trying to not rely on conventions of the signifiers of certain words. It's a struggle that I'm continuing to work through. This is all in flux, everybody. Just want you to know. Yeah, Jason. Well, maybe we could go to Jason.
sorry.
And I could talk with you a little later afterwards.
We
Thanks,
have
Kathleen.
53 seconds.
Okay, 53 seconds. Sure.
For a study going on, and I'm just wondering, maybe this is more of a practical question. You know, in grounded theory, we talk about collecting data to the point of saturation. What does saturation look like to you in this study?
That's a very good question. Yeah. This was something, you know, I think if I were writing something a little bit more academic, it would be a little bit more organized and contained, and I think that it wouldn't look so sort of explosive right now, or fragmented in such a way. And I intentionally tried to keep it fragmented, and I think saturation is something that I like to, you know, edge closer toward as a way of seeing where potential limits could be, and but also knowing that you get lost in an unproductive way through doing that. This is actually much more condensed than it used to be too. So it's a struggle, absolute struggle that I'm really thinking about quite a bit. I mean, I don't know if I ever thought about it in terms of saturation. I thought about it in terms of focus maybe, and pulling it from saturation into something more condensed. But it's also a flow though. It's between that sort of dilation and contraction that I think really, that's where the interesting ideas come from, through working with those kinds of dilations and contractions, edging closer toward something that would be called saturation, and then pulling it back to something that would be called something more focused. So, yeah, thanks. That's a really great question. Okay.
Okay, Michael, and then
I'm getting out of here.
anything else to ask you?
No.
Or say?
We can wait, I guess.